All right, so get ready because today we are going deep, really deep into the life and crimes of Ed Gein. He's the inspiration for like all those classic horror movie villains, Norman Bates, Leatherface, Buffalo Bill. It's kind of mind-blowing, isn't it? Like how a real person's life can become, I don't know, like fuel for some of the darkest fiction.
It's disturbing, right?
Oh, yeah, big time.
Yep.
And that's kind of what we're going to be digging into today, using excerpts from Ed Gein, Butcher from Plainfield. We are not here to glorify the crimes, just to try to understand how this happened.
Yeah, I mean, the really unsettling thing is that we're not dealing with, like, fictional monsters here.
Yeah.
We're talking about a real human being whose life basically became the blueprint for some of our deepest fears.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Ed Gein was born way back in 1906 in La Crosse, Wisconsin. And his childhood, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly a picnic.
Yeah, it was an incredibly isolated and troubled upbringing. His mother, Augusta, was this really dominant figure in his life, deeply religious. She instilled in Ed this very particular and very distorted view of the world, especially when it came to women.
Oh, I've heard about this, but how did that sort of like warped view actually play out in his development? I mean, did the book get into any specifics?
The book talks about how Augusta instilled this deep-seated fear of female sexuality in Ed. Like she basically equated women with temptation and sin. And it's fascinating, although deeply disturbing, to consider how that might have twisted his perception of women and, ultimately contributed to his really horrific actions later in life.
Yeah, it's almost like she created this ticking time bomb, even if she didn't necessarily intend to. And then you add in the trauma of his father's death in 1940.
And the mysterious death of his brother Henry, just 4 years later.
Yeah.
There are always these whispers and speculations surrounding Henry's death, some even suggesting that Ed might have played a role. The book doesn't make any definitive claims, but the timing is, suspicious, to say the least.
Okay, yeah, that definitely raises the hairs on the back of my neck. So now Ed's all alone in the world with this, really overbearing and controlling mother. And I can only imagine the kind of pressure cooker environment that must have been.
Yeah. And then in 1945, Augusta dies.
Mm.
And this is like a huge turning point for Ed. Without his mother, he was completely unmoored, just lost in his own world and incredibly susceptible to like the darkest impulses of his mind.
So it's like whatever fragile mental scaffolding he had just completely collapsed.
Yeah.
And that's when things take a truly horrific turn, which, brings us to November 16th, 1957, and the disappearance of Bernice Worden. Wasn't she the local hardware store owner?
She was the last person to see Bernice alive. And her son, Frank, happened to be the deputy sheriff. So when he found the store in disarray and that last receipt made out to Ed Gein, well, you can imagine that kind of set off some alarm bells.
Yeah, okay, I'd say that's a pretty big red flag. So the police go straight to Gen's farm, and what they find there is the kind of thing that fuels nightmares. Can you kind of walk us through it?
Yeah, so investigators find, you mentioned skulls as bowls, and they also find a lampshade fashioned from a human face, a belt made from nipples. It's really like he was trying to create some grotesque parody of the female form.
Wait, a belt made from nipples?
Yeah.
That's just, it's just unfathomable. I mean, what could possibly be the reasoning behind something like that?
I mean, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Like, it's not just about the violence. It's that deeply disturbing, almost ritualistic nature of his actions. It's like he was trying to recreate something, like possess something, but, in the most twisted way imaginable.
So beyond those incredibly disturbing items, what else did they find at the farm?
They found Bernice Worden's body. She was hanging upside down in a shed, decapitated.
Oh, God.
Doesn't get much more horrifying than that.
No, it really doesn't. And Gein himself, did he try to explain any of this?
Well, eventually he confessed to the murders of Bernice Worden and another woman who had disappeared a few years earlier, Mary Hogan. He also admitted to robbing graves and using the body parts, for those macabre creations that we talked about.
So this wasn't just a one-time thing. It was like a pattern of deeply disturbed behavior going back years.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And, it's here that we begin to see those seeds of inspiration for the iconic horror villains that you mentioned earlier, right? You've got the disturbed, mother-fixated personality of Norman Bates, Leatherface, and his masks made of human skin, Buffalo Bill with his twisted desire to create a woman's suit. They all owe, a debt to Ed Gein in a way. They took those horrific elements and kind of amplified them, for the big screen.
It's just almost too much to think about, that such darkness could exist in a seemingly ordinary person. So what happened next? Did he go to trial?
Well, it's a little more complicated than that. Initially, Gein was declared legally insane and unfit to stand trial. So he was committed to the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane.
So no prison time initially.
Not at first. But in 1968, he was actually deemed competent to stand trial for the murder of Bernice Worden. And here's where it gets really interesting.
Hold on, we're going to have to pause there. We'll be back in a moment with part 2 of our deep dive into the life and crimes of Ed Gein.
He was found guilty, but because he was still deemed insane, he was sent back to a mental institution, this time Mendota Mental Health Institute. Which I think raises an interesting question. Does simply confining someone truly address, I don't know, the root of such evil? Or are we just kind of like locking away the symptoms without really understanding the disease itself?
That's a very chilling thought. So I guess no dramatic courtroom climax or final act of defiance, just kind of a quiet ending in a mental institution.
Yeah, he actually died there in 1984 from respiratory failure. It's a very strange ending to such a horrifying story. But even in death, I think, Ed Gein's legacy looms really large. Like his crimes and his psyche, they continue to just fascinate and horrify people.
It's true. We try to kind of analyze it and understand it, but there's always that element of the unknowable.
Yeah, and that's what makes it like perfect horror material. It taps into those primal fears, those anxieties about the darkness that might be lurking within seemingly ordinary people. And the book, it really emphasizes how much Gein resonated with writers and filmmakers.
Okay, so let's talk about those iconic horror movie villains. I mean, we've touched on Norman Bates, Leatherface, and Buffalo Bill, but can we kind of go a little deeper into how Gein's case specifically influenced those characters?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's take Norman Bates from Psycho, for example.
Yeah.
I mean, the film doesn't come right out and say that Norman was inspired by Gein, but the parallels are pretty undeniable.
Yeah, you've got that whole creepy, isolated house thing, the unhealthy obsession with the mother, but what else?
I think it's the blurring of identities that's really interesting. I mean, that's pure Ed Gein. And Hitchcock, the master of suspense, he presents it all in this way that's both terrifying and psychologically disturbing.
No, you can't talk about Gein's influence on horror without mentioning Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I mean, you've got the masks made from human skin, the tools of butchery, even that whole, I don't know, grotesque family dynamic. It's like straight out of Gein's playbook. But the film takes it to a whole other level, doesn't it?
Yeah, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, they crank the volume up to 11. It's this visceral, unrelenting assault on the senses. And you're right that the family dynamic is key. I mean, Gein was completely obsessed with his mother, and you have Leatherface, who's, part of this twisted, cannibalistic family. It's like taking that isolation and just warping it into something even more horrific.
Yeah, and it definitely left its mark. It's still considered one of the most influential horror films ever made.
For sure. And then you have Buffalo Bill from The Silence of the Lambs, who kind of takes that whole concept of, like, using human skin to a new, arguably more disturbing level.
Yeah, his desire to create a woman's suit is, eerily similar to Gein's, creation of that vest from a woman's torso. But it goes beyond just imitation, right? Like Buffalo Bill's a much more complex character.
Yeah, he's definitely not just a mindless killer. He has this, like, twisted, almost artistic vision. He sees himself as creating something beautiful, even though it's built on this foundation of death and depravity. And I think that's what makes him even more terrifying.
It's that blend of the grotesque and the psychological that's just so unsettling. It's like he's holding up this dark mirror, reflecting our own hidden desires and fears.
Right, and I think that's the power of these horror villains who were inspired by Ed Gein.
Yeah.
They tap into something very deep within us, something that's both repulsive and fascinating at the same time. Like they force us to confront this darkness that exists, not only in the world, but also within ourselves.
It makes you wonder, like, what is it about Ed Gein that continues to capture our imagination, decades after his death? Is it just the sheer brutality of his crimes, or is there something more at play here?
I think it's a combination of things. Obviously, the crimes themselves are shocking, to say the least. But I think it's the psychology behind them that really gets under our skin.
Yeah.
Gein wasn't just a killer. He was a deeply disturbed individual. He was living on the fringes of society.
Yeah.
And he was shaped by this, like, toxic upbringing, by isolation, and by his own warped perception of the world. I mean, all of that really comes through in the book.
It's fascinating how those factors, combined with the crimes themselves, make him this kind of compelling case study in human depravity.
Exactly, yeah. He's like this puzzle that we can't quite solve. I mean, we can analyze his life, his crimes, but there's always that element of mystery, that question of like, what truly drove him to do those horrific things.
And that kind of unanswered question keeps drawing us back, right? Like we're drawn to the darkness, to the unknown, because it forces us to confront our own fears and anxieties.
Yeah. And it's this cautionary tale, right? It's a reminder that the line between sanity and madness is thinner than we think. And sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not the ones that we imagine, but the ones, walking among us.
So, as we kind of wrap up this part of our deep dive into Ed Gein's life and crimes, what's the key takeaway here? What can we learn from this, kind of unsettling journey into the darkest corners of the human psyche?
I think the biggest takeaway is that the human mind is this complex and often contradictory thing,
Yeah.
We're capable of such great love and compassion, but also of like unimaginable cruelty.
And Ed Gein is this stark reminder of that duality. He was a product of his environment, but he was also an individual who made choices, albeit horrific ones.
And those choices kind of created this ripple effect that continues to this day, both in, the world of true crime and in the realm of horror.
It's like his story tapped into our collective unconscious and unleashed this wave of horror that continues to fascinate and horrify us.
His legacy is powerful. It's a story that keeps resonating with us, forcing us to confront that darkness that exists, I don't know, both within ourselves and in the world around us.
Okay, let's pause here for a moment and we'll be right back to finish up our deep dive into Ed Gein.